It's my pleasure and honor to have you on here, and I want to thank you for doing this. If you're
Having me.
unaware, if you're unaware of us, we're a crazy community of meat-loving, carnivorous human beings that just love going back and eating food that makes us healthy. And just for the folks on YouTube, this is also streaming to YouTube, or at least the first part of it. If you guys want to catch the full thing, come and join us over at meaterx.com. You can sign up for free and check the full interview out. So anyway, without further technical stuff, Sally, I want to just, first of all, I've been aware of your work for many, many years now. And I mean, there's a lot of people these days talking about nutrient-dense foods and so on and so forth. And we are in this sort of, maybe this sort of crazy offshoot carnivore community of that, and we all sort of generally fall in line with that sort of agreement. But you've been talking about nutrient-dense food for many, many years. You're the head of the Weston A. Price Foundation, which is obviously linked to the ancestral health type, the general category. So, like I said, maybe you're ahead of your time, but actually we're all too far ahead of our time. We should all be going backwards, I think is a better argument we should make. And I want to just thank you for the work you've done. Can you maybe lend a little more background description that I may have probably I'm sure I didn't give you full credit for everything you've done. Can you just kind of give us a little bit more of your background, if you don't mind?
Of my background.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, yes. I and a few others founded the Weston A. Price Foundation in 1999. So we're just past our 20th anniversary. And we promote the principles of healthy traditional diets. So that includes not only what people ate, but how they prepared it. And that is a really important part of this discussion. And when it comes to meat, it's particularly important because there were ways they ate meat and then there were ways they did not eat meat. And they can make a huge difference in your health. I also wrote Nourishing Traditions, the cookbook that challenges politically correct nutrition and the diet dictocrats. And that's, again, looking at what people ate and how they prepared it in the past. And you use the words nutrient dense. Everything they did in their diets aimed at maximizing the nutrients in their food. And everything we do today in our in the processed food and also just in meat production, meat preparation, minimizes the nutrients in the food. Still, meat is a nutrient-dense food. It's way above fruits and vegetables in the vitamins and minerals it contains. It's more than grains, more than legumes, but it's not the highest. The highest is organ meats. I don't know if you call that meat or what, but I think you should just differentiate. I think we need to differentiate because organ meats are 10 to 100 times more nutritious than muscle meats. So in a scale of nutrient density, the fruits and vegetables are at the bottom. I'm not saying don't eat them. They have a role in our diets as vehicles for butter and lard and things like that. And then at the top is the organ meats. And things like raw dairy products, eggs, seafood like fish eggs. So there's a few really, really high nutrient-dense foods that we should include in our diets. And they're always animal foods. They're always animal foods, the ones that are most nutrient-dense.
Yeah, I think that's anyone that has access and can read a nutrition chart, that's pretty easy to conclude. And then, obviously there's a whole issue of bioavailability and
Yes.
how our gut handles those foods, which is very different. And, clearly, I think meat is generally not bound to a lot of what we call anti-nutrients and things like that prevent the uptake of certain minerals and other even macronutrients. And so it's, almost heretical to say that fruits and vegetables are at the bottom of the nutrient density. If you read today's literature, if you look at every headline, on the mainstream sort of news out there. And I want to, you kind of mentioned the fact that the politicalization of the food. It's interesting. Can you, what exactly do you mean by that?
Well, definitely food has been politicized. We have guidelines, and the guidelines always steer people to the foods that make the most money for the food processors. And the foods that make the most money for the food processors are industrial seed oils, which people call vegetable oils, and the processed grains and the sugars and so forth. So these are the foods that the guidelines steer us towards. And let me give you an example. So the guidelines tell us not to eat animal fats and not to eat butter and to drink reduced fat milk. And this is quite tragically, it's really a kind of genocide is applied to growing children. So what do we get in the schools? They can have skim milk, which they hate, like water, or they can have low fat, flavored milks like chocolate milk or strawberry milk. And these milks have more sugar in them than sodas. I kid you not, they literally have more sugar in them than sodas. And they're extremely high in protein, which they get by putting non-fat dried milk in to give these things body. And then, of course, they have a lot of additives and colorings. And by the way, the strawberry flavored milk has no strawberries in it. It's just strawberry flavor. So these are what we give children in school. It's an absolute travesty of any kind of guideline. And but they certainly make a lot of money for the dairy companies and so forth. And I was doing some research a few years ago on school lunches, and there were about 5 websites dedicated to promoting flavored milks for children. How wonderful they were for children. They could get their calcium and protein without having any fat in the diet and so forth and so on. Just makes you weep, really, to see what they're giving children in the schools today.
Yeah, and then they're pushing for meatless Mondays and so on and so forth. Hey, I want to dig a little more into the seed oils, because I think you had a video entitled like the oiling of America or something like that. It was quite fascinating. So I want to ask about, like particularly polyunsaturated fatty acids. Those things exist naturally in nature. I mean, there are nuts that have them, meat has some on its own, and then there's a way they extract it from things like soybeans and rapeseed and the corns and stuff like that. Do you find that the extraction process with the hexanes and the decolorants and deodorizers and the 25-step process and all the chemicals involved to be the egregious part of that, and then it turns it, you get it in a bottle and you add it, and it's in every single processed food on the planet? Or is it let me just put it, if I ate a soybean or I ate soybean oil, which one would you say would be worse for me, and perhaps why?
Well, I wouldn't eat anything soy. They'd both be bad for you, but you couldn't eat a lot of soybeans. They're really bitter, and it would be really hard to eat soybeans. But we're getting the oils in huge amounts all the time. And one of the problems with the soybean oil, it's got estrogen compounds in it. So it's very feminizing. But the worst part of the extraction of these oils is the heat. So they are heated 5 times from extraction to the bottle in all of these processes, and very high. And the thing about polyunsaturated oils is that they are fragile, and when they're heated, they break down into these breakdown products called free radicals or aldehydes, and they do a huge amount of damage in the body. This is well known, and yet you get the paid the pundits of nutrition doing these guidelines. The vegetable oils must have totally killed their consciences, because these things are known. We know that vegetable oils are carcinogenic. We know that they cause heart disease. We know that they interfere with hormone production. They contain no cholesterol. So why do children eat a lot of fat? One of the reasons is so they can get the cholesterol from the fat. Children don't make cholesterol very easily. And they need the cholesterol for the growth and development of their brain and nervous system, and for the second brain, which is their guts. And they're just not getting it. Children, we all need animal fats. It's like the basic food that we all need. We need other things too, but the fats are just absolutely essential, because They provide us with fat, but they also provide us with nutrients we can't get anywhere else. And they provide children with cholesterol, which they need for their development of their brains and nervous system. And this phobia about fat, I mean, you couldn't design it any better to destroy the human race than to tell them not to eat animal fats, because they're essential for reproduction.
And I obviously don't eat any plants at all. I mean, I eat all animal products. So I'm totally with you on the necessity of animal products. Now, I just want to, just maybe clarify a little bit. I want to talk about, because we have this demonization of saturated fats, and I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. But and soybeans perhaps were a bad example, but let's say I want to eat a walnut, or even I want to eat some bacon, which has, or bacon has a lot of monounsaturated fat, as I'm sure you know, and a lot of people like to tout monounsaturated. But if I eat a piece of meat, it's going to have a mixture of saturated fat. It's going to have some monounsaturated fat, and often beef is almost more monounsaturated than saturated in many cases, depending on the breed and so on and so forth. And it does have, 10% polyunsaturated fats or something along those lines. Are those polyunsaturated fats the same or as problematic as the, multiply heated seed oils?
No,
do you have concerns about those? Okay.
Of course not.
Okay.
And they're in the matrix of the fat, with the fat membranes and so forth, and they're much more protected. They're protected by the saturated fats and the monounsaturated fats also. Now, I mean, I'm sure that there is some breakdown, but it's nothing like what you get from the vegetable oils. And there's another fat in animal fats called arachidonic acid. It's unsaturated omega-6 fatty acid that we really cannot get anywhere else except animal fats. And arachidonic acid is critical for the brain. 11% of the brain is arachidonic acid. It's critical for healthy skin and healthy digestion. It supports a good tight junctures between the cells. And that's what you want for healthy skin and for a healthy digestive tract. You want, good, strong bonds there. And that's what arachidonic acid does. So, and that is something that we just do not get anywhere else except for animal fats. Years ago, some plastic surgeons in Los Angeles did a survey of their patients to see if they could find any dietary correlation between having a lot of wrinkles, which is the last thing anyone wants is wrinkles, right? And they found that the women who were doing a lot of polyunsaturated oils, vegetable oils, they were the ones with lots of wrinkles, because they don't have a good integrity of the skin.
Yeah, we see that with smokers too. There's something called alpha antitrypsin, which smokers see a lot of wrinkles with. And just meeting you for the first time, Sally, and I know how old you are because it's widely available online, and you look great for your age. I'm not going to give away your age, but you look fantastic. You don't have very many wrinkles for someone that is, and I'm 53, and you've got me by at least a year or two. I'll say that. But
yeah.
Anyway, so you're kind of walking the walk and talking when you talk to
I really think that's the most important thing. It's like the fundamental thing to have a healthy diet is to completely avoid all these processed oils, and that means that you'll be avoiding processed foods, of course, as well.
Yeah, let's talk about saturated. Go ahead.
But it doesn't mean your diet has to be dull and dry. I mean, we eat tons of butter and we eat fat on the meat, and that was one thing I really wanted to stress today was in traditional cultures, they never ate lean meat. They always ate meat with the fat, and they knew that lean meat would make them sick.
Yeah, this
hunger.
This goes back to. I was going to say this goes back to stuff like Stefanson when you see him interviewed. He said you got to have the fat with the lean. And
but there was a really, really good study in Australia of the Aboriginals, and it's just a wonderful study. They followed them all year long and asked them what they ate. And they ate oysters only at a certain time of year because that's when the oysters were fat. And they analyzed the fat in the oysters, and you would think it's a lot of omega-3 or something, but no, it's saturated fat. And then a certain fish they only ate at certain times of the year, and they actually melted the fat off the fish and put it in a tin can and drank the melted fat. So it's not just, Stefansson, but we also have in the literature examples of, other parts of the world. And one of the things they told the researchers was that if they had protein without fat, it was rubbish. Lean meat was rubbish, and it was just thrown away.
Yeah, that's, and that goes back to, what I've done, quite a bit of research into this stuff. And, when we look at, I know one of the things that Weston A. Price was famous for was visiting these sort of indigenous tribes all around the world. And one of the arguments that we've made is, even though they can teach us a lot, the situation they're in may not have been the same situation that maybe even their ancestors are in 50, 100,000 years ago, when we had these huge megafaunal animals with much higher fat content around. And so, like you said, they would traditionally pick out, like we can look back to the Native Americans, where they would intentionally go for the fattier buffalo because they know those are the ones that are going to give us the fat.
Right. They would hunt it selectively, and they hunted older animals because older animals had more fat.
Absolutely.
And if the animal was too lean, they just threw it away.
Yeah, and so I watched a video I think you're presenting, in something to sort of talk about the dietary guidelines, and appreciate you doing that, and hopefully, I tell you, and I know there's a gal named Nina Teichholz who may be aware. She leads the Nutrition Coalition, and they've been lobbying and getting research, and it seems like it falls on deaf ears. It seems like the fix is in on these dietary guidelines people. It seems like the USDA is. I don't know. That's my impression looking at it as from an outsider.
Well, they're paid by the industry.
Yeah,
they're paid by the food industry, and they know where the bread is buttered. Excuse me for saying that.
Yeah, the bread is margarine.
It's just, we shouldn't be looking to the government to tell us how to eat. We shouldn't have guidelines.
I agree 100%.
Let the parents set the guidelines for the schools. Let private nonprofit organizations like the Weston A. Price Foundation, go to them for guidelines. But it shouldn't be the government, because it's always going to be taken over by biggest of the industries.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious to anybody who looks into this, even with one eye open. You can see that pretty easily. Let's talk about saturated fat. There was a Pure study came out 2 years ago or 3 years ago now. What was the president of World Cardiology Association? I can't remember the fellow's name, but I think he was one of the lead authors. Saturated fat associated with better longevity, better health outcomes, less cardiovascular death. Of course, widely dismissed by the mainstream people. Every study that comes out, Nutrirex just came out 2019, six studies in Annals of Internal Medicine. Red meat doesn't cause cancer, doesn't cause heart disease, or if there is any evidence, it's extremely weak. Again, they get attacked. We see this over and over. All the evidence is contrary to this nutritional dogma is just attacked. How do we overcome that? I mean, what's the way to get through all this stuff?
Well, you have to think for yourself. And I think that's the really large difference between how traditional cultures ate and how we eat. The traditional cultures did not have to think about what they were going to eat. They ate by the seasons, what animals were there at what time. They knew instinctively how to prepare things. It just wasn't a matter of debate about what to eat or how to fix their food. Now we have lost all of that. That's the evolution to becoming civilized individuals, and it's a good thing. It's not a bad thing, but it's fraught with dangers, and we've lost this instinctive idea of how to eat. We have to relearn, and we have to think about it, and that's what good science does. It supports our decisions, and there's lots and lots of good science out there. It's just the bad science that gets in the papers. And so we have to think about every morsel that goes in our mouths. We have to make a decision. And that is the great difference between the modern people and the traditional or so-called primitive people. They didn't have to think about it. That's the great challenge of spiritual development. It's the challenge of learning how to think. So, but the goal is to, how can I put this? So the heart and the mind go together. What we want to eat is what we should eat. There shouldn't be a struggle inside of each one of us on, I know I should eat this, but I want to eat this, which isn't good for me. Okay.
Yeah.
What I have found over the years is as you eat a better and better diet, as you eat more and more nutrient-dense food, a cleaner and cleaner diet, it just almost becomes second nature. You look at the junk food and you know you've gotten there when it just kind of makes you sick to your stomach. It's not tempting. It's not tempting anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I find that, like, for me, tearing into a nice fatty piece of red meat is instinctually, primitively, and viscerally satisfying. I mean, it's just like that is what you're made to do. I want to ask you about, yeah, you're right, and it is a shame that we do have to think about, because everything we go through the grocery store, we're inundated with this. It's not even real food anymore. It's just product. I mean, it's cheap industrial product that they're passing off as food, and they're throwing some supplements in there so we don't just die acutely. But I mean, it's just sad to see what choices are people made. And you've been around, and I've been around long enough to we can watch as time has gone by. The population's getting sicker and sicker and sicker, and the prevalence of chronic disease, the prevalence of obesity, the prevalence of autoimmunity.
And more infertile. It's more, we are having fewer children, and one other thing I want to say about meat, though, I think everyone here understands that you need to eat the meat with the fat, that lean meat is not good. But you also need to eat the meat with the collagen. So we have two kinds of proteins in our body. We have muscle protein, we have collagen protein, and there's a fly in here. So we actually have more collagen protein in our bodies than muscle protein. And the collagen, of course, forms our joints, our tendons, holds the body together. There's collagen layers around every organ. We need collagen to line the digestive tract. Collagen lines our skin. So where do we get collagen? And this is another big difference between modern and primitive ways of eating. They ate the whole animal, and we tend not to. We don't like those gristly parts, and that's where the broth comes in. You make broth with the bones and the joints and the gristly parts and the skin, and that is melted collagen, and then you use that broth to make a sauce or gravy or whatever, and that's really delicious meat when you're eating it that way.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people that certainly advocate, they call it a quote unquote a nose to tail style of eating. Right. There's certain, obviously certain cultures traditionally would do that. Other cultures, perhaps not as much, depending on what part of the world you are.
Well, it was pretty widespread. The Eskimos cooked the bones with their meat. The Native Americans did. Africa, of course. Asia, and Europe. I can't think of a culture, possibly Australian culture, but I can't think of a traditional culture that didn't do stuff with those bones and just cook everything in a low heat pot.
Yeah, let's talk about the heat, because and I would say I know it's at least in parts of Europe, that some of the offal was often not prized, and it was often given to like peasants and stuff like that. But besides those different observations, then the question is, are these people eating in a subsistence situation, or are they eating in a surplus situation? I think there's different thoughts on that. But let's talk about high heat cooking, because is it plausible that people cooked over an open fire early on, particularly as humans started to learn how to harvest fire, and then the slow cooking is something that developed later? What are your thoughts on, am I killing myself by cooking on a grill? Thoughts on that?
And the grilled food is so good. I know that the Australians, they just put those kangaroos right in the fire. So there was some scorching and burning there. But typically meat was cooked by braising, which was in water. It was cooked in a liquid. And so you never got above the boiling point, basically. And often it was lower than the boiling point. So that's probably the ideal way to cook, but I think the occasional steak on the barbecue is fine. You want to have really good gut flora, so you want to have a little bit of sauerkraut or something with your charred meat, just to protect the gut.
Yeah, because I like I said, to cook on a pot, you have to invent the pot and the cooking vessels, and I'm not sure when those were first invented.
Well, and they dug pits. That was another thing. They would dig a pit, they would line it with leaves and put hot rocks on top. So that was another type of braising.
Yeah, that's something when I lived in New Zealand, I know they do that. I think they call it a hungy, which is what
Yeah,
the Maoris would
hangy.
call
Yeah,
a hungy or hangy or something like
yeah.
that. It's kind of interesting. Yeah, that is an interesting thought that, throw a pig in a pit and stuff like that,
And
cook it
what they
for
did was they made
hours.
a cup with the banana leaves or whatever
Mhm.
kind of leaves, and they put the blood in one cup, and then they had another one. I won't say a cup, something fairly large, and then the other one they put the fat in that one, and they put that in the pit also, and kind of cooked those things, and that was the really prized part of the pig.
Yeah, I'm getting hungry thinking about that. I've actually, it's kind of funny. I'm in the middle of a little bit of a fasting period of time. I don't know if you're a fan or if you promote that or you guys talk about that much, but occasionally it's something that folks do here. Let me ask you about,
So let me just add. So
okay.
they ate the meat, they ate the fat, they ate the collagen, and they ate the organ meats. Now, here's a wonderful example, and this was described by Samuel Hearn, he was in his 20s. He was the first European to go with the Canadian Indians into the hinterland and up in the Arctic Circle. And here's what they did when they killed an animal. They took the stomach of the animal. They had stone knives, and they shredded up the tender meat and put it in the stomach, the organs and the fat, and then they put the blood in the stomach and tied it up and smoked it over the fire. And he said it was absolutely delicious. It was salty because they put the blood in. He said the flavor was wonderful. And so this was how they cooked the whole animal. And again, they're not just tearing the meat off the bone. It was tender. It was like a terrine or a pate that they made, but it contained the whole animal. So I think the more we can do things similar to this, the healthier our meat will be for us. And I think a good example is something like the boudin, which is the sausage in New Orleans, which has the blood. It cooked in broth and has liver in it and fat and of course spices and everything also. But that would be a kind of close cousin to the way these traditional people were eating.
Yeah, when I was in high school, my girlfriend they call them coonasses, and they would cook the
Yeah.
boudin, and
Yeah.
I had some, I remember that. And then I guess in Scotland, they have the haggis, which is
The
kind of
haggis.
similar to what you're talking about with stuff.
And all over the world. In England, they had things called puddings, and these weren't sweet. They were round things that hung up in the butcher shop, and it was the stomach of an animal with all of this in it, all chopped up, often with a grain like oats or rice in Asia. And this is pretty much how people ate. They could buy these puddings and take them home and dip and cook them in a pot of water in front of the fireplace. Remember, these people didn't have kitchens, so they went to the butcher and got their puddings. In Europe, they went and got the slice of terrine, which has the organs in it, or the pate. So this type of meat product, it's tender, it's kind of ground up and mixed up, usually highly flavored, but with the meat bones, organ meats and tendons and everything, it's all there.
Yeah, I think that one of the problems is we've certainly when I go to Europe, you see they have a much wider variety of things like
Oh yeah.
pâtés and different ways preparing sausage, which I think are superior to what we see in the U.S. in many cases. In the U.S., they obviously go to the cheapest.
It's actually illegal to put liver in sausage in the United States.
To put liver in sausage, and well, I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
I thought
it's not. I don't think you can call it sausage. I'm actually kind of looking into this because we have a farm with pigs, and we're looking into kind of developing some of these products.
I've actually, I bought meat online, like sausage online from U.S. Wellness Meats and Thousand Hills out, I think, Minnesota, and they've sold me liverwurst and Braunschweigers. So, I mean, that does have liver in it. So
right, okay. Well, I take it back. I think they can't call it sausage though.
okay, maybe not sausage. Okay, it might be a semantics thing.
It's like the Irish bangers, because they have breadcrumbs in them, they can't call it sausage.
Gotcha.
They have to call them bangers.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting because there's some battle, because, there's a lot of topics we can talk about. Well, I'll jump into this one now. So there's some people that are making these sort of faux meats, and they're calling them sausage in some states, or calling them burgers in some states,
Yeah.
and it's soybeans and canola oil, and just garbage. And I'm sure you have a thought on those products, perhaps.
Well, I wrote 3 blogs on the fake meat. So there's one made with pea protein. There's one made with genetically engineered soybeans. So the pea protein one, that one tries to kind of attract the health conscious crowd. And then the soybean ones, I think that's the Impossible Burger. But the other one it's really not commercially available yet, but it's this lab meat. Okay. And they start with these meat cells, and then they try to grow the cells. So they're growing these meat cells in the lab. And people think, well, this is really kind to animals and everything. But what they feed the cells is called fetal bovine fetal serum. And bovine fetal serum is blood taken from the fetus of the fetuses pulled out of dairy cows when they go to the butcher. They're alive when they bleed them to death, and then they use this fetal serum to feed the meat cells. So it's totally gruesome. I mean, just. And what's wrong with just eating meat? We already have what we need.
Well, I mean, obviously, cows are destroying the planet, and meat is so evil, and so on and so forth. And I've looked into this stuff. So Impossible Burger, they got the soy leg hemoglobin, which is that GMO soy that's never been tested in humans before. We don't have any long-term data on that. Patrick Brown thinks they're going to end the meat industry by 2030.
Yes, that's right. He said that's our goal. 2035, no one will eat meat anymore.
Yeah, and it's not just the fact that they're using fetal bovine serum, but they're also the input. That these cells don't grow from nothing. They don't produce protein from nothing, and the input they get basically just monocrop soy and pea protein from China. And so, I mean, and it's just interesting that they just there's a gal named Diana Rogers, who you may or may not be familiar with.
Yes, I know Diana. Yeah. Uh-huh.
So, and I've interviewed her several times. I really like Diana, but she just showed that Beyond Meat, who is the one that does the pea protein, they have pea protein in canola oil, I believe, and and that's Ethan Brown, I think. They just show that their transparency on what their environmental impact is with regard to greenhouse gas was rated at 0%, compared to even these, meat conglomerates like Tyson Foods, who gets a 98% for transparency, like at least saying this is what our impact is. Beyond Meat's not even telling you what theirs is, and they're making all these environmental claims when they're clearly just 100% profit motive. But let me just switch to another gears a little bit. So blue zones. People in the blue zones, the Sardinians, the Okinawans, the Loma Linda, 9,000 people in Loma Linda that live longer, who are wealthier than most people, and, don't smoke and don't blah, blah, blah. They eat a plant-based diet, clearly. So that is the key to longevity. What are your thoughts on the blue zones?
I actually have written extensively on the blue zones. I wrote a series of blogs, and then in my book, Nourishing Diets, I have a whole chapter on the blue zones. What's interesting, apart from the Seventh-day Adventists, there have been studies of every blue zone. And the studies routinely found that the ones who were old and, in their 80s, 90s, and up to 100, were the ones that lived in the mountains and ate more meat. And like all peasant communities, they ate the whole animal. So the guy who wrote that book, Dan, I think his name.
Like Dan Butner, his name.
But Butner or something like that. I mean, he just lies about what he found. Or not only, he doesn't even lie about it, he describes, for example, he describes this guy in Sardinia butchering a cow, and he's got his hand inside the cow, and he describes the peasant's lunch, and there's hardly any plant foods in the lunch. He describes all these things, and then he goes on to conclude that these people are eating plant-based diets. It's the craziest book I've ever seen, because it's just, he doesn't conclude what he's actually described in the book.
There was interesting, there's a paper that came out, I believe 2019, might have been late 2018, where they looked at the claims he made from blue zones, and they said one of the main likely causative reasons for longevity in the blue zones was poor record keeping, fraud, because they said that the record keeping in those countries was just abysmal, and so they can't even confirm how old these people actually are. And of course, Butner, went back on that, but this was a study that went on looking at that. We've got, and again, I know Weston A. Price was talking about people in the 20s and 30s, I believe. And I look at modern day population. I always like to point to groups like Hong Kong. Hong Kong, which regularly now boasts the longest life expectancy in the world, with average life expectancy something like 85, 86. Women living to like 89. They eat the most meat of anybody on the planet. I mean,
Oh, is that right?
they're eating something like 1.5 pounds of meat a day on average for their citizens, which is like 4 times the UK and almost 3 times the US. And they're living longer than anyone else on the planet, and no one seems to say anything. And they have 7 million people, which is multiple times the population of all the blue zones put together. So it's very, very.
Well,
very
I finished my chapter on the blue zones talking about my husband's family, and I hear he's just come in, where everybody lived to 100. I'm not kidding you. Both his parents lived to 100. He's got aunts who are still around at 100. His in-laws lived to 100. He had an uncle who lived to 104. And what did they eat? They ate lots of meat. They were farmers. They ate beef, lamb, organ meats, tons of butter. They had dairy foods, but not a lot of dairy foods. It was really a meat-based diet. And they also had shellfish. The best shellfish in the world is in New Zealand, oysters and mussels and things, and fish, and they had fruits and vegetables and grains and everything as well. But this was a high animal food diet, and really good animal food, pasture-raised animal food. And talk about butter. I mean, this was a culture that ate lots of butter, and that was my husband's family. And the interesting thing about my husband's family is everybody in the family cooks. And I visited all his kids and everything, and everybody cooks. Nobody eats junk food. It's just they eat real food.
Yeah, this is a sad trend, and I've pointed this out before. There was a study. I'll come back maybe a year or two ago, and they were seeing that there was an actual decline in the number of people, particularly young people in this millennial generation, that was eating cereal. And
eating what cereal?
They were cutting back on the cereal consumption, and the reason given was it took too much time because they had to rinse a dish, because you have to actually pour it into a bowl and eat it, and they would rather open a package like a little bar, like a protein bar, eat that, throw it in the trash, and be done. And so we've gotten so far away from not even cooking, but even wanting to wash a dish, that it's gotten so crazy. But let's talk a little bit about dairy a little more, because there are a lot of people that in this community that some of us do reasonably well with dairy. There's other people that did have problems with dairy, and some people talk about the quality of the dairy. Can you go into a little bit about that? There's pasteurized versus unpasteurized versus raw versus A1 versus A2 versus butter versus milk versus. So talk a little bit about dairy, because some people do better on dairy than others. And why is that?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm kind of the dairy queen because I eat a lot of dairy foods. Milk and cheese. I probably eat more milk, cheese, and butter than meat. And I started a campaign for real milk, which was for raw milk. Now, pasteurized milk is garbage. You shouldn't touch it. It's really bad for you. It's indigestible. None of the nutrients are available for assimilation. It's just garbage. But here's what dairy fundamentally does in any diet. It provides calcium. And that is a real danger in an all-meat diet. Where is your calcium? And don't tell me it's because you eat some kale and stuff, because you can't, the calcium's kind of blocked in the kale. In traditional cultures that did not have dairy foods, they took special pains to eat bones. The bones of birds or small animals were ground up and added as a powder or paste to the food, so they would get enough calcium. So, there's been a tendency to denigrate calcium. Oh, it's not important. We're getting too much calcium. But the traditional cultures that Dr. Price looked at, they were getting 1,500 milligrams of calcium a day. And that's real easy to do with dairy foods. Super easy. But if you don't have dairy foods, then you have to think about it. Do it a different way. Eat powdered bones or cook eggshells or something like that to get your calcium.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say this stuff, Zach, 'cause I know you've been talking about this a long time, and there's other people like recently have sort of pretended they invented those type of things, and it's kind of
Mhm.
interesting to see that. And clearly, my background is an orthopedic surgeon, and so I'm
Oh,
very
yeah.
familiar with calcium requirements. And like for instance, when I had people that had fractures, we would recommend you get 1,500, maybe 2,000 milligrams of calcium a day, and the RDA is up there. But it's interesting. You do see that some pushback on the amount of calcium. There's some evidence that higher protein diets result in higher calcium absorption. You rightly point out that certain foods do block the absorption of calcium,
Yeah.
particularly when it comes from plant foods. Now, I will point to a guy that most of us would consider a kind of a dirty word. A guy named Walter Willett recently penned
Oh,
an opinion
wow.
about calcium requirements, and stated that maybe the human calcium requirements are much lower than we think they are, and he pointed a number as low as 200 milligrams per day. So I mean, I find that kind of an interesting statement, and I
Sorry
wonder.
about my phone.
Oh, that's okay.
It's almost going to stop.
That's okay.
um,
Can you?
I think for growing children, it's a question of, do you want your children to be tall?
Yeah, clearly.
Kids who get a lot of good dairy, raw dairy, they grow tall and robust and strong. I have 4 grandsons being brought up on raw milk, and they're really tall for their age. And that's a good thing to be tall. I think it's a great gift to end up tall, because we know that tall people end up as leaders. They make more money. There have been many studies about tall people, and tall people are just more successful in life. Now, I
Yeah,
don't
the
know
only
if it's because, who knows why, but if you want your kids to be tall, feed them raw milk and they'll grow tall.
Yeah, it's interesting. You look at some of the studies, like the Scandinavian countries, where dairy is a big part of the diet, and they definitely have taller people. Some of the tallest people in the world. We look at the
And
Danish.
also Holland, people are really
Yeah,
tall in
Holland,
Holland.
right, Holland, and then some like Croatia and places like that, and it's kind of
Mhm.
interesting to see that. And I'm 6'5", so I ate dairy when I was a kid growing up. But there's the only downside, I guess, one of the downside is we see that bigger people on average live shorter times than people that live longer that are smaller. That's the one I say negative. And then buying clothes can be a pain, and fitting in airplanes, all those things. But most of those things I don't disagree with. And certainly height is a good metric for population general health. And we see
Yes,
stunting in these communities that are suffering from iron deficiency and animal products. In fact, we look at a lot of these countries in the world where they have lack of animal products and general malnutrition. They're extremely small. I mean, they're
yes.
clearly
And
stunted.
also
So
you see a lot of anemia too. I'm glad you mentioned iron. We're just about to do an article on iron in our journal. And the iron people are getting today is the iron, it's basically iron filings added to cereal, and toxic iron. It's iron the body can't use. It goes to the wrong places. A key nutrient for proper iron assimilation is vitamin A. And often you can improve your iron status by adding a liver or cod liver oil or foods rich in vitamin A to your diet.
yeah, that's again that's stuff that's being promulgated recently by people again, I know you guys have been talking about that stuff for a long time, so it's good to see that. Um, Let me ask you about. So this is a community, as strange as we are, have people that have eschewed vegetables and fruits and nuts and whole healthy grains, and we eat a lot of meat, and many of us eat organ meats, and many of us eat a lot of fat, and we are generally healthier than we were before. Now, the question that a lot of people say is, why the heck could somebody give up vegetables and be healthier? And what do you say to those people? Is it the preparation of the vegetables? Is it some other factor that now made their gut susceptible to maybe high levels of anti-nutrients, oxalate damages, or whatever we want to say?
Well, all the irritants are in plant foods. Isn't that correct? So all the irritants in grains, there's a lot of irritants and anti-nutrients in vegetables. That's not so much. Well, there are some in fruits. The pectin in fruits can be very irritating. So I can see where getting off of these foods would improve your gut health, be much more soothing to your gut health, and you're going to a more nutrient-dense diet for sure. Um, but I come from a background of French cooking. I just want to eat a lot of things. I want a really varied delicious gourmet diet. And so then if that's what you decide to do, then the question is, how do you prepare these foods? So kale, for example, is extremely hard to digest, and people are eating kale chips, and the worst is kale smoothies, just undigestible. You may think, well, you ground it up, it's really small pieces, but you can't digest those small pieces. I can promise you. And kale and these dark, rough, leafy greens were always cooked a long time, and then eaten with fat. My colleague Tom Cowan who lived in Africa, and he said the typical meal was some meat or some carbohydrate foods like yams or whatever, cooked. And towards the end, they always added what they called the word, they had a special word for vegetable. And it was any kind of plant that they picked, leaves, whatever. And these were always added at the end, but they were cooked. So, if you're making your beef stew or whatever, this is when you add your greens at the end. We make, my husband and I make an oxtail soup. So lots of connective tissue, really gelatinous broth. You've got your chopped up meat. We add grains to that, let them cook a long time. Grains need a long time to cook. And then at the end, we add some chopped up greens to that. So there is a delicious, nourishing soup, and it's got all food groups in it.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to consider, I don't really consider vegetables as much of a nutritional value thing. I think they provide flavor, quite honestly, and I don't really look beyond that.
They provide minerals, and of course, the one thing is vitamin C, which you can get from fruits. And I think the best source of vitamin C is fermented foods. So if you're making sauerkraut with cabbage, then you're getting 10 times more vitamin C than you'd get from the cabbage in the fermented foods.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people that will talk about fermentation, and I've talked to many people, a guy named Bill Schindler, who's an anthropologist who's run around living with some of these modern indigenous tribes and talking about the fermentation that he does, and he takes great pains to do that. It's a lot of work, unfortunately.
Well, a lot of meat was fermented too.
Yeah, sure.
There's a guy named Speth, S-P-E-T-H, who's written some really interesting articles on this. We tried to get him to speak at our conference, but I think he's retired. He never answered my emails, but he talks about the fermentation of meat, and even whole animals were put in the lake or whatever and allowed to completely ferment. The Eskimos, of course, ate fermented meat. The Africans were the great fermenters. They fermented meat, organ meats, fat, hooves, bones, everything was fermented. And when you ferment something, you greatly increase the nutrient density. Plus, you're adding all the good bacteria.
Yeah, there's, when you look at traditional techniques, I guess it depends on where you were. You could dry it in the sun. Because you kill these big animals, you can't eat it all in one sitting.
You have to preserve them. Yeah.
So ferment.
And by the way, salami is artisan salami is a fermented food. And so that's an easy fermented food to eat.
And it's delicious too, by the way. That really is really nice. What else did I want to ask you about? So here's the thing. So when you say things like, pasteurized milk is garbage, or this is and this is something I'm working to do. We are trying to get a clinical trial funded on looking at people eating just a meat-based diet, because no studies have been done. Uh-huh. Do you know of any studies that say, I've done a randomized controlled trial looking at someone eating pasteurized milk versus raw milk or something like that? Have those studies been done? And if so, why not? What is preventing?
Well, they have been done. There have been some really good studies in Europe comparing growing children on pasteurized milk versus raw milk. And there is very good data. And the children who grew up on raw milk had less asthma, less respiratory illness, less allergies, fewer episodes of skin disease. So they were definitely healthier. And those were, controlled studies.
Yeah, I'd love to see those.
I don't mean controlled in the sense of laboratory controlled, but there were there were control groups doing the raw milk, the pasteurized milk.
Oh, and you know how long do the studies go for? A couple of years, or wonder how?
Oh yeah,
long?
yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That'd be very interesting to look at some of those things because like I said, I'm in a community where we have literally thousands upon thousands of people that literally come off, immune biologics from autoimmune disease, and their arthritis is going away and their depression is going away. I see this every single day, and I've collected
Well, I'm sure, yeah.
hundreds and hundreds of anecdotes, and we've got them published. And the problem is, when you look into the medical community, who a lot of people look up to their physicians as people that are going to give them health advice, and even though that health advice may not be that helpful, they're hesitant to prescribe a diet or tell somebody to do this way without a clinical trial or something that can hang their hat on. And so that's something I've really been trying to do. And so,
well, if you go to realmilk.com, there's a lot of articles on there about raw milk benefits. And one thing raw milk is really good for is allergies. It really cuts back on allergies.
Yeah, are you saying that raw milk is good for allergies, or that pasteurized milk is bad for allergies?
Well, both. So allergies to pollen and things like that really helped with raw milk. And then, of course, the pasteurized milk is so hard to digest that a lot of people are allergic to the milk because the proteins are all messed up by the pasteurization process.
Do you have any concerns at all about people that have gotten, issues with contaminated raw milk and have gotten, significant infections? And do you? There are people that reported that, and those cases exist.
It's a very safe food, and compared to meat, look at how much contaminated meat we have.
You do have an occasional E. coli, which is even less than lettuce and some of the other vegetables that we see.
Yeah, the vegetables are the worst, of course, but yeah.
Why do so many states not allow raw milk? There's only I can't remember how many states in the U.S. Maybe 13 let you buy raw milk, and I think California is one of them. But why do so many states?
Okay.
What's the answer on that?
43 out of 50 states allow farmers to provide raw milk in one form or another, either retail sales, on-farm sales, cow share programs, pet milk sales. We sell raw milk as pet milk on our farm. So it's 43 out of 50, and we're aiming for 50. But the thing is, raw milk is so widely available today. I call it the Amish Empire. The Amish have tractor trailer loads of raw milk going all over the country.
Well, that's good.
Did you say you were from Florida? No.
I'm in California right now.
Oh, you're California. Well,
yeah,
of course, it's very available in California, but
yeah. It is.
Again, if you go to realmilk.com and look up where you live, and you'll find where the raw milk is.
Wonderful. That's a great resource, and thank you for that. Why pet milk, by the way? Is it? Are you not allowed to say for human consumption? And
it has to say for animal consumption. It's a loophole that we're taking advantage of, and I like it because I don't have to have insurance for it.
Interesting. Okay.
It's not for human consumption.
Well, Sally, go ahead. Sorry.
I also, you don't have timid customers. They get it,
Gotcha. Sally, thank you. This has been wonderful. I think you're just a wonderful resource. And can you let people know where to find more about you and the Weston A. Price Foundation? Anything else you'd like to get out there so people can get more information?
Okay. So the Weston A. Price Foundation is named after Weston Price. So it's WESTON APRICE, westonaprice.org. It's a huge website. We are a membership organization, so if you join, you get our journal. But everything on the website is completely free. And we have this corollary or auxiliary website called realmilk.com, which helps you find farms that sell raw milk or sources of raw milk. As for me, my website is nourishingtraditions.com. nourishingtraditions.com. I write a blog. I wrote a series of blogs about blue zones. I wrote a series of blogs on the fake meat. And right now I'm looking at coronavirus, the fake coronavirus. Did you know that they've never actually isolated a coronavirus? And I did want to just put a little plug in for my book coming out, a new book with myself and Tom Cowan. It's called The Contagion Myth. And I hope it just blows all this nonsense out of the water. And that's available on Barnes & Noble and Amazon for pre-orders. It'll be out in September.
Wonderful, Sally. Thank you so much. I appreciate your input, and we really enjoyed it. I think this is a great bit of information out here. And good luck to you, and good luck with your endeavors. And I hope a lot of people will visit you and the Weston A. Price Foundation to get more information.
We have a conference coming up. Our conference is in Atlanta in November, and no masks, no social distancing, real live conference. We're the only nutrition group or food group that is having a live conference this year.
Wow, good for you. Anyway, all right, guys, thank you very much. We'll see many of you guys tomorrow, and you guys take care. Thank you so much, Sally. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.